Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 15, Lost John's Cave. Statement of Laura Popham regarding her experience exploring the Three Counties system of caves with her sister Elena Sanderson. Original statement given November the 9th, 2014. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. Caving has always been one of my hobbies. My main hobby, really. All the equipment can get quite costly after a while, and I don't earn enough to have more than one expensive activity like that. Elena, my sister, came along with me on a trip a few years back. She'd lost her job and her house in quick succession and was staying with me. I thought it would cheer her up. It did, and we've been doing it ever since. Stupid idea, really. I wish I'd left her crying on the sofa. At least then she'd still be alive. We didn't really have the money to actually go potholing all that often, so I spent a lot of time reading and planning and just looking at stuff online. We averaged maybe a cave a year. Elena was never quite as into it as I was, though. Don't get me wrong, she was no claustrophobe, and I wasn't forcing her to follow me into the darkness on threat of a family rift, but she mainly enjoyed the climbing, and I always ended up going a little bit deeper than she wanted. I think, to be honest, she would have preferred to get her exercise under the open sky, or, failing that, in an above-ground gym. Maybe we should have tried cliffs or a climbing wall, but caving was our thing. It had helped her when she was in a bad place, and she knew how much I loved it. She also wasn't too keen on the scrapes and bruises you always get on expeditions. She used to joke that it felt like the earth itself was trying to kick her ass. If only she had known. We did have fun, though, and she always chose to come along. I never forced her to be there. I never did that. We'd done some of the Three Counties cave system before, a short trip of only a couple of hours into the Riftpot Caves. The whole system is huge, though. I mean, there's a reason it's called the Three Counties system, so there was plenty more to explore, and we'd had so much fun the first time that I wanted to try it from a different angle. We were going to go in through the Death's Head Hole, then travelling through Lost John's Cave as far as Gavel Pot before heading back. The prospect of this excited me, as in order to travel between Lost John's Cave and the Gavel Pot system, we were going to have to do some cave diving. I had never done cave diving before, and neither had Elena, although she told me that the prospect spooked her less than some of the squeezes we'd had to do to get there. We made all the arrangements, got our permits in order with the CNCC, and had my husband, Alistair, note down all the details in case anything went wrong. You never go caving unless someone knows where you're headed and what your plan is. I had also done as much research into our route as possible, as I had no intention of straying from the well-explored, thoroughly charted caves. I was never much of a pioneer, if I'm being honest, and I was happy to stay to the main route. No, what I used to love about caving was the feeling of being deep inside the earth, the cold, solid walls folding around me. It always used to feel like they were keeping me safe, though it doesn't feel like that anymore. It was Saturday, June 14th.
You can't hold anymore.
I had taken the Friday before off work to prepare, and was planning to spend Sunday nursing well-earned bruises. Elena and I drove up to Lancashire, towards Death's Head Hole. I live in Manchester, so it wasn't too long a trip. We parked up at Leck Fell, the closest you could legally park. I was surprised to see that we were the only ones there when we arrived. It was a sunny day in late spring, and the weather was meant to be clear for days, with no chance of rain making the caves too dangerous. It was a perfect day for caving, but it seemed we were the only ones taking advantage of it. Death's Head Hole is not nearly as impressive or intimidating as its name suggests. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you might end up missing it entirely. When we went, much of it was covered in wild plants and bracken. It was barely larger than we were, and I remember at the time the phrase, "a perfect fit," came into my head unbidden. Still, the resin anchors were in good condition, and we hooked up and descended our ropes without incident, despite a few unexpected twists in the pothole.
Your inventory is full.
It was a bright day. It was almost noon when we went down, so the light filtered a lot further in than I would have expected. It was some time before we had to turn on our headlamps, but eventually we did so. By the time we hit the bottom, there was none of that sunshine left to be seen, and the silent darkness of the cave swallowed us. Beneath our feet, the gentle waters of the underground stream ran their course, as they had for thousands of years, undisturbed by the rough tread of humanity, and we followed them. It was a much gentler descent than that which we had come in with, but it was very slippery, and I was glad to have invested in a waterproof map case, although it made it slightly harder to read at times. Elena stood back to let me have my ritual. There was something I always did when I first entered a cave, and that was to take a moment to turn off all the lights and place both my hands upon the cold, earthen wall. I remember once when I was a child, we went on a school trip to White Scar Cave up in Yorkshire. It was a lovely, safe, accessible cave. It was absolutely beautiful, which I suppose is why it was popular for such trips. After we'd been down there for a few minutes, the guide led us much deeper and told us to stand very quietly. She turned off the lights to show us children what true darkness is like. I had never seen anything like it. It was such a pure black, so encompassing. In the warmth of the underground, I found myself full of a joy I've never forgotten. Even among a class of 30 schoolchildren, I felt like the only presence that mattered was the cave. Ever since then, I would always take a moment on any potholing trip to do the same, feel again that utter darkness, with no sound but the gentle flowing river and my own breathing. I don't think it's an uncommon practice, actually, but I rarely went caving with anyone other than Elena, and while she indulged me, I don't think she ever really got anything out of it. We turned our lights back on and began to head deeper into the cave. I had a map, which we began to follow as closely as we could. I'm quite experienced in these things, but even I find it hard sometimes to match the irregular lines and angles of the underground passages to the often abstract shapes written into the map. There were several junctions that were significantly smaller than the map would seem to show, and the point of entry into Lost John's cave was what we would call a squeeze. It wasn't on the map, but it seemed to be the only way through. Now, most passages you find yourself travelling through when caving are much smaller than would normally be comfortable for people to move through. After all, they were eroded by often tiny streams of water and minor tectonic events, so accommodating humans was never high on their list of priorities. A squeeze is something different, though. A squeeze can be a hole less than a foot wide, sometimes going on for a long way, the rock pressing in on all sides of you and your helmet banging whenever you try to turn your head. In a particularly bad squeeze, there are parts where the walls and ceiling are so close that you can't move your arms or bend your legs to push forward, and you just have to squirm your way to the other side like a worm.
You can't carry anymore.
This was a particularly bad squeeze. Near the end, it got so bad that if Elena hadn't gone in first, I would have told her to go back and forget Lost John's cave. About halfway through, I realized that it was far tighter than I had imagined. I called ahead to make sure Elena had made it out okay. She called back, told me it was a hard one, but she was fine. I wanted to answer her, but by that point the rock was so close around me, it was stopping me from doing anything but holding my breath and willing myself forward. A hand grasped me firmly on the shoulder and pulled me through. Just like that, I was out. Elena gave me a smirk as if to comment on the fact that she had made it through unassisted, and I, the true cave aficionado, had needed a hand. I wanted to shoot back some pointed comment about her being more slender than me, but by the time I had got my breathing under control again, the anger had died down, and I managed a weak smile. We made our way through the cave until we came to the cathedral. It's a large, arching cave quite breathtaking, though it requires a couple of sheer drops to access, one of about 40 feet. We had experience and equipment enough to make quite light work of it, though, and soon we were beneath the cathedral, in what is imaginatively called the crypt. We stopped here for a rest and a bite to eat, and Lena told me an interesting thing about Lost John's cave. While I had been concerned with finding maps and as much information as I could on getting through, she told me she had been looking into the history of the place. She said everyone puts the apostrophe in the wrong place when talking about Lost John's cave. As the story goes, it was two men, both named John, who were the first to delve deep into the cave. They went too far, though, and their candles had gone out. They lost their way together in the sprawling labyrinth of tunnels and never emerged. Elena said she thought it was quite sweet in a strange sort of way, and joked that if she ever got trapped underground, she'd want it to be with me.
I used to sell plows
I
and
smiled
scythes
and
to farmers,
nodded, though
but since the
secretly the
monsters,
thought appalled
it's
me.
been swords
It
and
wasn't at the
shields,
thought of being
thieves and
entombed down
spears.
there. At the time, it didn't seem like such an awful fate, but the thought of having to spend my last days with Elena was a bit too much. I'm sorry, that's a horrible thing to say about the dead. I loved my sister, and I loved spending time with her. But to be lost beneath the earth is such an intensely private thing. Maybe she realized that at the end. After our brief stop, we made our way down through the dome. It was beautiful, and this was the part that I had been dreading, as all the experienced cavers I had talked to had said that this was the hardest descent. It went easily. Very easily, actually, and at the time I remember getting a weird feeling, like I was being swallowed. Finally, we made it through the shale cavern and into the master cave. As we stood there, I felt anticipation and trepidation in equal measure. Before us lay the passage filled with the still water of the sump. We were about to have our first cave dive. I had always been told by experienced cave divers that you never judge the distance correctly. The first few times you try to surface, you will always hit your head on the stone above, so it's best to try and not be too alarmed by it. I reminded Lena of this as we got our equipment ready, and she told me she remembered, and then surprised me by asking to be the first one to go through, saying something or other about conquering fears. I said yes, why not, and let her go through. As I stood there alone, waiting, I began to feel something I had never before felt this far underground. I began to feel uneasy. It was as silent as it had ever been, but there was something else there beneath the silence, almost like a whisper. I shook the feeling off when it came time to follow Elena and dived into the pool. It wasn't far to the junction which would lead us onto the gavel pot. I pressed myself through the narrow space, half swimming, half climbing, but I thought I had gone far enough and attempted to surface. Clunk. My helmet hit lightly against the roof of the tunnel. Fine, that was as expected. I kept swimming another few meters and tried again. Clunk. That gave me a nasty shock, as I should have been well past the end of the first tunnel. I kept going until I reached the end of the subterranean waterway and went towards the surface. Clunk. I started to panic. Was this a dead end? There was no further I could go. Where was Elena? She couldn't have come back past me. The tunnel was far too narrow. In desperation, I tried to come up one more time. I broke the surface to see Elena laughing to herself and holding a rock over the part of the water where I had been trying to emerge. I swore at her violently, not sure whether to hit her or join in her laughing. She apologized, but said she had seen the rock and couldn't resist, so I was always going on about the helmet banging on the roof. I sat there, suddenly drained. The adrenaline of my panic seemed to have sapped much of my energy, and I think my sister could see that, as she didn't press me to go on. We both knew that the passage through from this junction to the gavel pot itself was a much longer dive, and neither of us was really up to it. We just sat there for a while in silence. It had taken longer to get this far than we had planned, so I suggested going back the way we came rather than continuing to go deeper into the cave. Elena agreed, but as I turned away, she asked me, how lost I was, in a low, grating voice. I snapped back that we weren't lost at all, that I'd followed the map exactly. And she just gave me this look like she didn't understand what I was talking about. I shrugged and told her that I would go first on the way back, and she agreed. I was eager to get back and be above ground in a way that I had never been before. I got my equipment ready and dived back into the water, heading back towards Death's Head Hole. That's when everything started to go really, really wrong. To begin with, the water didn't end. I tried to surface as I had on my first time through, and again there was that clunk as my helmet hit the roof of the tunnel. I moved on and tried again, but still no luck. I began to fight down the rising alarm, told myself that the tunnel had a definite end and I just had to reach it. But it just kept going. No light, no surface, nothing but this cramped waterway pressing on every side, waiting to claim me. I don't know how long I was desperately swimming forward, but I almost screamed with relief when I reached my hand and felt it break the surface of the water. It wasn't the cave I expected. What stretched before me was a tunnel even smaller than the waterlogged one I had left. I scrambled forward into it, not because I wanted to go on into that unknown passage, but because I was worried about Elena being able to get out of the water behind me. I must have taken a wrong turn, except that didn't make sense. I hadn't turned at all, and more than that, there weren't any turns or junctions in this part of the cave. I had checked all the maps of this area over and over, and they all put it as a straight line. I waited, wanting to talk to my sister when she surfaced and discuss where to go from here. She didn't emerge. I don't know how long I lay there. It was too cramped to check the time, but it felt like hours. I wanted to go back and check, but I couldn't even turn around to see. I just waited for a splash that never came. I decided to go on, press forward until I at least found somewhere wide enough that I could turn. As I crawled on, I scraped against the jagged rocks until I felt them pressing into my bare skin where my clothes had ripped. I can deal with it when I'm out, I kept thinking, but the passage just got smaller and smaller, until at last I couldn't move any further. I finally accepted that I was going to have to try and squeeze back the way I had come without even turning round. I started to shuffle backwards, and my feet touched against solid rock. The tunnel was gone. It was then that I screamed, and my light went out. I said earlier that I enjoyed the pure dark of the cave. I was wrong. I had never truly known a darkness like this. Unable to move, barely with breathing space enough to cry for help. Even as I lay there, it felt as though the walls pressed me further, and I knew that the stone I had always believed to be my friend and protector was going to entomb me here. In the distance, I saw the faintest point of light. It looked like a candle flame, far down the tunnel, so weak that it lit nothing but itself. It grew closer, but any hope it might have given me quickly died as it grew. It was coming towards me so slowly, and deep down I knew that it was of this place. It meant me harm. As it got closer, I saw the pale hand that held me, and I heard something. It was Elena. It sounded far off and muffled, but I was sure she was calling for help. I shut my eyes for all the good it did in that place, and tried desperately to will it all away. When I opened my eyes again, the light was still there, but it changed somehow. It seemed brighter, and as I looked, I realized it was no longer coming from a candle. I could hardly believe it, but it looked like daylight. With every last ounce of strength I possessed, I pushed myself forward. Had I been climbing this whole time? My clothes were ragged and torn, my skin scraped and bloody, but after nearly an hour, I broke onto the surface through a small opening, not in any of the maps. I breathed in fresh, cool air, and I screamed as long and loud as I could. That was how Alistair and the cave rescue team found me. Apparently I'd been underground for almost 24 hours, and he had called in the cave rescue service. I was well cared for as I waited for news of Elena. My wounds were treated, and I was given food and water. It took another day before the rescue team told me what I think I already knew. There was no sign of her anywhere. I never saw her again. And she was added to the list of fatalities, so I suppose that's an end of it. I haven't been underground since, and I don't intend to. Statement ends. This is a strange one. I have rarely come across a statement written with such conviction, yet where so many of the details are provably false. The CNCC have no record of Ms. Popham getting a permit for this expedition, and the number of other permits they issued for June 14th would indicate that they certainly weren't the only ones in the cave that day. Beyond that, Death's Head Hole and Lost John's Cave are, as Ms. Popham pointed out, well documented in layout, and according to Sasha's reckoning, the route she described is borderline nonsensical. What is true is that on 15th of June, the Yorkshire Dales Cave Rescue Organisation was contacted by Mr. Alistair Popham, who told them his wife and sister-in-law had gone caving the day before and had not returned. I sent Tim to check the details. Martin declined to help with this investigation as he's a bit claustrophobic. And he found some more bizarre discrepancies. Ms. Popham was not found above ground as she claimed. She was found a few yards from the bottom of Death's Head Hole, unresponsive and kneeling next to a small pile of burned-out candles. Alistair Popham claims not to have seen any such things being packed. She only came out of this stupor when brought above ground, at which point she started shouting about her sister Elena, demanding they go and save her. There is also the matter of the recording. She does not mention it in her statement at all, but Ms. Popham took a camera with her into the cave system. It was never claimed back from the CRO after her rescue, and Tim managed to gain enough access to copy the footage. Best not to ask how, I think. Most of it is mundane footage of Ms. Popham and her sister cave climbing, which seemed to match her statement. But the last recording is somewhat alarming. The timestamp puts it at just past 2 o'clock in the morning of June 15th. It is completely black, though whether this is because it was in a pitch-dark cave or simply because the lens cap was still on is unclear. The audio is what concerns me, and here I will play a sample. The video is 2 hours and 43 minutes long, and the audio remains consistent throughout. No sign of Elena Sanderson has been found in the 2 years since her disappearance, and I have made the decision not to follow up our findings with Miss Popham. Recording ends.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by Rusty Quill.
We've got troubles. The dead raise their hand against...
I can hold that for you.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 16, Arachnophobia.
Safe travels!
Why are these monsters?
News!
So long.
The truth is, I'd have returned to the beach, but
Statement of Carlos Viteri regarding his arachnophobia and its
So then
manifestations.
shield, not your style?
Original statement
you'll
given
find what
April
you're
9th,
looking for
2015. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. I hate spiders. I know, everyone hates spiders. Anytime there's
My pleasure.
any
Welcome,
list of the top
welcome.
however many fears,
A
they're
fine
always
warrior
up
like
there.
yourself,
And whole
I'm
horror
sure
franchises have been
that's
built
what
on the
you're looking
basic
for.
premise that people hate spiders. But not like me. Not like this. It's not the sight of a spider that gets me, not the legs or the eyes or even the webs they leave behind with only the drained corpse of their insect victims still inside. It's the presence
Come
of
again.
the spider. The knowledge of its being somewhere near, waiting to crawl on you, and all the warning you get, that gentle tickle of its legs as it climbs upon you. I'm not explaining myself very well. Let me try and phrase it in a different way.
Good day then.
I can watch any number of films about the things, documentary or horror, it doesn't matter. I can read books on them. I can stare at close-up pictures of their weird spider faces all day long, and there's hardly a shudder from me. But I had to move from my last house after discovering how many spiders made a home in my garden. I walked out there one day with the intention of smoking a cigarette, sat on the rusty garden furniture that had come with the place, and looked up. There it was, stretched between two large branches, silhouetted against the sky. It sat. Objectively speaking, the thing was tiny, couldn't have been more than
Everyone's
half an
talking
inch leg to
piss.
leg.
I found out.
But up there, suspended, high above me, its body black against the slate-grey sky, filled me with a sickening dread. I leapt up and started to head back inside, but as I did, my eyes flicked wildly around the rest of the garden, and everywhere they came to rest, I saw more lurking spiders, more webs. There were dozens that I could see, which meant there must be hundreds more I could not. There was no way I could live there after that. How could I sleep, knowing how many crawling horrors moved and twitched and spun their filth just a wall away? I'm not a fool. I know that all gardens contain spiders. Every single one is filled with them, nestled in any crevice or hiding spot they can find. But now I knew. I had seen them in their spindly multitudes, and I could not unknow how many were there. I could not stop thinking of when winter would come and they would seek to find a way into the warmth of my home. So I had to move. Renting in London moves very quickly, which is a pain if you're looking to find exactly the right place to live. But if you just need to get out and into a place as far away from a garden as possible, and you aren't choosy, it can be sorted out very fast indeed. I found a place in Boothby Road in Archway. While nearby Elthorne Road was full of houses and gardens, no doubt infested with spiders, my building was surrounded by concrete driveways and parking spaces. The only vegetation were a few window boxes the other residents kept. The place was old, but had been kept clean enough that I didn't need to worry about hidden webs, and the rooms, though small, were open enough that I could keep an eye on all corners. I was on the second floor, so any eight-legged intruder would have something of a climb to access it, although I was acutely aware of the distance a spider can shoot its web when it wants to get somewhere. The building was also quite happy with pets, so I got a cat. I had heard from a friend who had a pair of them that they have a habit of catching spiders and eating them, slowly and torturously. This sounded good to me, so I invested in an older tabby from a local shelter called Major Tom. This is all a lot of superfluous information, I know, but you have to understand the lengths I went to, how little I would tolerate a spider to live in my presence, to fully grasp how unnatural it was, what happened to me, what is still happening to me. I saw a spider about 3 months ago. Not unusual, certainly not as unusual as I would like. Even with all my precautions, they still managed to get into my home once a month or so. My normal course of action is to immediately flee the room and leave Major Tom inside to deal with it, returning after a few hours. In all previous cases, this had worked fine. I believe Major Tom definitely ate the majority of them, and those spiders that had simply fled back into the shadows, well, I can trick myself into believing they also suffered such a fate. It may be that my grey feline companion never actually ate any of them, but he was a fine enough placebo that such a thought didn't concern me as much as it might. I remember that month there had been a few of them. Our building had acquired something of an infestation of some sort of insect I didn't recognize, small, silvery worms, almost like maggots, but slightly longer, and I assumed that they provided a good meal for the 8-legged little monsters. This spider was different. I felt it the moment I laid eyes on the thing, standing in the middle of the kitchen wall, displaying itself boldly, as though it wanted to be as visible as possible. I felt that familiar rushing fear, as though the floor had dropped away and 1,000 tiny legs are crawling upon every inch of my skin. But there was something else there. I was aware of this spider in a way I had never been of others that preceded it. It wasn't the biggest, maybe an inch wide, but its abdomen was swelled grotesquely. I could feel every one of its void black eyes focused upon me, see each hair on its fat, bulbous body, and smell the venom I knew dripped from its fangs. I hate spiders, as I have said, but I would have sworn that this one hated me back. None of this was enough to make me think twice about gingerly pushing Major Tom towards the thing with my foot and fleeing the room. I made my way into the living room and closed the door behind me, leaving Cat and Spider to deal with each other. I sat there, watching the TV, some panel show rerun, trying not to think about the thing on my kitchen wall. An hour passed, then 2, and finally I felt like I had enough stability of mind to open the door and confirm that the damned arachnid was gone. The moment I opened the door, I felt something furry brush against my leg. Choking down a sudden moment of panic, I looked, and sure enough, there was Major Tom, hurrying out of the room at a run. He didn't seem hurt or upset, so I assumed his job was done. And I turned back to my kitchen and froze. The spider sat in that same spot. It wasn't eaten, it hadn't fled. From what I could tell, it hadn't even moved. The only way I was sure the thing was real and alive was that I swear to you I could see its mandibles twitching with anticipation. I stood there, unable to summon the will to close the kitchen door or enter into it fully, and cursed Major Tom for a useless bag of fur. It was another hour before I was finally able to move. The whole time I stood motionless in the doorway, watching the fat spider that paraded itself on my wall. Still, it remained in place, and I couldn't help but feel that it was daring me to do something, to take action, to kill it. I began to move. Slowly, ever so slowly, I approached it, reaching a hand over the table and taking the half-drunk mug of coffee, now long cold, in my hand. I gripped the handle so tight I was sure it would snap off in my fingers. Finally, I stood before the spider, preparing myself to calmly crush it against the wall. Then it moved without warning, and I hurled the mug against the wall with all my might. It hit the spider dead on and exploded in a shower of coffee and china. I stood there for a minute, breathing hard, but all that remained was a large stain on the wall and mug shards littering the floor. I should have cleaned it up immediately, but I was so tired, as though killing the spider had taken every ounce of wakefulness that I had within me. I simply turned around and went to bed. My dreams that night were many-legged, but there's not much unusual in that. I spent the next morning cleaning up the detritus from my battle with the spider. I wished that I had gotten the coffee cleaned before it had dried, but by lunchtime the place was looking very much as it had before. As I swept up the smashed mug, I noticed that the largest shard, emblazoned with the design of a stylized blue owl, had a vivid smear on it. Brown, red, and green were crushed onto it where it had hit the spider. It disgusted me, but looking at it, I couldn't help but feel a small surge of triumph, and I smiled as I threw it into the garbage bag. Major Tom watched, impassive as always. The next few days passed without incident. Major Tom had never been much of an indoor cat, so I had installed a cat flap some time before to allow him to come and go as he pleased. After that first encounter, he seemed to spend more time outside, and I saw him less and less as the week progressed. I didn't think much of it. We'd had a particularly mild Christmas, so it made sense that he'd be enjoying the outside as much as possible before winter really set in. It was the Friday after my first encounter that it happened. I came in from work, tired after a difficult week. I used to work as a data analyst at an online betting company, and decided to order takeout and relax in front of some TV. I eased myself back into my armchair and reached for the remote. I was aware that Major Tom wasn't anywhere to be seen, which was odd, since he usually got fed shortly after I arrived home, and he was never one to miss a meal. Still, I didn't think of it, and turned on the television. I hadn't turned on the satellite box, so what showed at first was an empty blue screen. I reached to the other remote to turn it on, when I realized the blue screen wasn't empty. There, sat on it, black against the glowing background, was a spider. And not just any spider, but I swear to you, and here's where you march me out of your little institute as a time-wasting lunatic, but I swear that it was the same damn spider. It was the same size, the same shape, the same thick, pulsing abdomen, but more than that, I felt it. I felt it in that fear that hit me like I had been punched in the stomach, and I felt it in the way that that thing just sat there, unmoving, waiting for me to kill it again. I was stuck to my chair, just watching this spider as it stood there on the screen of my television. I called for Major Tom, but there was no response. God knows how long I sat staring at the spider on my television. I don't wear a watch, and I couldn't move my arm to check my phone. If I hadn't been sat down, I would have run already, but standing up was more movement than I could bring myself to make while it watched me. Finally, I got to my feet. It was less effort than I expected when I finally mustered the will to do it, although that's not really how it felt at the time. At that point, it felt almost involuntary, as though something were lifting me, hoisting me to my feet by unseen strings. I began to walk, but rather than fleeing the spider, I found I moved towards it, till I stopped there, so close I could have touched it, though my mind recoils at the thought. Before I realized exactly what I was doing, I lifted my leg and kicked the television, instantly crushing the bulbous spider beneath the heel of my shoe, and, now I think about it, narrowly avoiding a nasty electrocution. I had had no inkling I was capable of such a thing, but once again the spider was dead, and I had a slimy stain on my shoe. I threw the shattered remains of the television away, burned the shoe, and tried desperately to return to something approaching my normal life, but it was no good. The spider that I had killed had come back, of that I had no doubt, and a deep paranoia began to set in as I waited for it to return again. I saw Major Tom only once in the weeks that followed. He came in, sniffed at the bowl of food I had continued to put out for him in the vain hope of luring him back, and turned around and walked away. As he left, he gave me a look that I could have sworn was one of pity. I called in sick to my job, as I wasn't really sleeping. So much of the time was spent checking nooks and corners for the spider that I was a nervous wreck. More than once I did find spiders, but they weren't the one that was after me, so I killed them without a second thought. My life descended into the mess that it still remains today. I was right, though. 2 weeks after I kicked it to death on my TV, there it was, over my bed, standing on the wall over the spot where my head lay each night as I tried in vain to sleep. It was that damned spider, and I recognized it. My bedroom is better lit than the kitchen, and it wasn't silhouetted against a screen, so for the first time, I got a really good look at my tormentor. I realized that I had seen it before the kitchen. I was not born with a fear of spiders. In fact, for the first 6 years of my life, I can only assume I existed in peaceful harmony with them. But that changed in the autumn of 1991. I didn't live in London then, but with my parents in Southampton, and we would visit my grandparents every Sunday out in the nearby New Forest. They lived on the edge of a suburb, and from the bottom of my grandmother's garden you could see fields stretching away for half a mile to the tree line. I used to spend a lot of time down there, and if you were lucky, sometimes there would be horses. That day, there were no horses, just an overcast sky and wind that threatened to blow off my blue woolen hat. I was wandering through the scattered trees by the fence I wasn't allowed to cross, and I noticed a fallen log. I had seen it before, of course, as there was little in that place that changed much between my weekly visits. But there was something different about it. In one of the hollows sat something that I did not recognize. It was pale brown and looked soft and lumpy, like a small sack. Knowing no better, I approached it and saw, perched on its top, a small spider. It watched me, warily, its fat abdomen twitching, but it did not move. In my childish ignorance, I thought it looked silly, and I reached over for it, but I tripped. My hand hit the spider, killing it instantly and plunging into the egg sac below, causing it to tear open and explode. I was suddenly covered in thousands of small, white crawling things, those tiny, dripping, half-formed and unfinished spiders. They covered my hands, my face, my eyes. I can never forget that feeling. And since then, the presence of spiders has filled me with the deepest dread. And that was the spider that sat before me on my bedroom wall. Though I remember little of what the long-dead thing had looked like, I knew it was the same. Can you be haunted by the ghost of a spider that destroyed your childhood? It sounds absurd, it sounds laughable. But there it was. I didn't know why it was here. I didn't know why I was reaching for it. My mind screamed to stop, and I let out a terrible cry, but my hand kept moving towards it inexorably, as though willed by something else. This ghost spider felt real enough when I crushed it beneath my palm, legs splayed and body bursting warmly against my skin. Once I had control of my limb once again, I spent the rest of the night washing my hand. I am moving out of that building. I officially gave Major Tom's paperwork to the family on the ground floor he decided to move in with, and will be leaving the moment I find somewhere, anywhere available for immediate rental. I can't risk seeing the thing again. I'm also seeing doctors trying to get a referral for psychiatric treatment or possibly some antipsychotic medication. But I felt I should probably give you a statement as well. I don't expect you to believe me, but if ghost spiders falls under anyone's remit, I suppose it's yours. Statement ends. I think the most important lines in this statement come at the very end. Antipsychotic medication and disbelief are, I think, exactly what Mr. Vittery needed to get through his problem with, ghost spiders. There simply aren't enough details given in this statement to actually investigate, short of Martin confirming that Mr. Vittery did indeed live at the addresses he provided. I would have asked him to follow up with Mr. Vittery himself, but he appears to have passed away shortly after giving his statement. He was found in his Boothby Road residence after neighbors complained of the smell and had apparently been dead for over a week. Coroner's report lists asphyxiation as the cause of death, probably due to choking, though it doesn't say what he choked on. Simply lists foreign organic material blocking his throat. If I were of a more alarmist nature, I might think the appearance of Mr. Vittery's corpse lent some credibility to his tale. But as I told Martin earlier, he was there for over a week. So there is very likely a perfectly natural explanation for the fact that his body was completely encased in web. End recording.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 17, The Bone Turner's Tale.
Statement of Sebastian Arakoya regarding a new acquisition at Chiswick Library. Original statement given June 10th, 1999. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. Books are amazing, aren't they? I mean, when you think about what they really are. People don't give the actuality of language the weight it deserves, I feel. Words are a way of taking your thoughts, the very makeup of yourself, and giving them to another. Putting your thoughts in the mind of someone else. They are not a perfect method, of course, as there's plenty of scope for mutation and corruption between your mind and that of the listener, but that doesn't change the essence of what language is. Spoken aloud, though, the thought dies quickly if not picked up. Simple vibrations that vanish almost as soon as they are created. Though if they find a host, then they can lodge there, proliferate, and maybe spread further. Still, it is not a reliable method in terms of a thought's endurance, as humans are fragile creatures and rarely last a century. A book, though, is another story. There are written texts that have outlived the civilizations that created them. Imagine thoughts hundreds, thousands of years old, preserved and ready to be taken again. Corrupted or translated perhaps by a culture that does not understand them, but still, ideas that have outlived by lifetimes the mind that first conceived them. Will the thoughts that first ran through Shakespeare's head ever stop being thought by someone, somewhere? And a book so dense with a mind's fossilized creations, is it any wonder they have been ascribed such power throughout the ages? Or that an old library with heavy tomes covering every wall seems to have such a weight to it, beyond the physical presence of the texts it holds? I used to work at Chiswick Library. I didn't have such ideas back then, though. I just knew I loved books, always had. And so when the opportunity arose to work in my local library, I jumped at the chance. I had been a voracious reader ever since I was old enough to hold a book for myself, and even before that my mother tells me I would pester her constantly to read to me. I suppose you might say my mind has always been receptive to the thoughts that lurk in the written page. Still, Chiswick Library is a long way from the cramped and austere libraries you're probably imagining. It's light and airy, with bookshelves and carpets that speak more of cash-strapped local councils than of the rich majesty of knowledge. It has an extensive children's section, and the vast majority of its stock are dog-eared paperbacks of true crime, literary fiction, and reference books. It has a modest collection of books on tape, and the atmosphere, though quiet, is far from oppressive. In a word, I would sum the place up as unthreatening. It was 3 years ago when this happened. I had already been working there for about a year when the book first turned up. Now, we used to buy all of our books new, and I never did any of the acquisitions for the library, so I couldn't say when or where it might have been bought from. It looked old and pretty beaten up when I first noticed it. It was handed back with 4 other books at the front desk, and as I was scanning them through, I noticed that one of the barcodes didn't seem to match up. The barcode and ISBN both registered as being that of Train Spotting by Irvin Welsh, but the book itself was an almost featureless black paperback, with a title on the front in faded white serif font, The Bone Turner's Tale. I was a bit confused and called the librarian, Ruth Weaver, over to ask about it. She didn't recall seeing it ever before, but stuck in the front was the ex libris bookplate of Chiswick Library, as well as a lending label with a handful of stamps going back several years. Ruth shrugged and told me not to worry too much about it. We'd get it recorded and put on the system properly. But something about the situation bothered me, so I decided to check the record of the man who had returned it. His name, at least according to his library card, was Michael Crewe, and sure enough, 3 weeks ago he had borrowed 4 books from us, specifically the 4 others he had returned. I suggested to Ruth that perhaps he was a self-published author who was trying to trick his way onto our shelves, and she laughed, saying it was probably it. Although why anyone would go to the trouble of faking it just to get on the shelves of Chiswick Library was beyond her. The book looked worn, though, like it had seen decades of being read, with a line creased down the spine and one half of the cover faded from the sun. Nor, from what I could see, did it list any author at all. It was at that moment that Jared Hopworth came in, and I had to put the book to one side. Jared and I had once been fast friends, growing up on the same road, attending the same schools. We had spent much of our early life as inseparable, but he had always been, well, not to put too fine a point on it, thick as mud, and when I went away to university, he stayed behind. I think he saw it as something of a betrayal, and when I finally returned, I knew immediately something had changed between us. He spent the time I was away becoming a bit of a crook, and upon my return began what would eventually become a campaign of petty terror. He was always very careful to stop before he did anything that might get the police involved, and I guess there was enough leftover affection from a childhood spent together that I never really thought about reporting him. It was...
Hello, Elias?
Do you have a moment?
Not really. I'm sort of in the middle of something.
I understand. It's just that Miss Hearn has lodged a complaint.
A complaint? I could just as easily complain about her wasting my time.
That's not how it works, Jonathan.
I wouldn't have even needed to do the recording if Rosie had kept her equipment in better condition.
Regardless, I would prefer that you not antagonize anyone connected to the Lucas family. They are patrons of the Institute after all.
Fine, I'll be more lovely. Now, can I get back to work?
Very well. By the way, have you seen Martin?
Oh, he's off sick this week. Stomach problems, I think. Blessed relief, if you ask me.
Statement resumes. It was worst when Jared visited the library, because that inevitably meant that he was bored enough to seek me out for harassment. Sure enough, he started chatting with me, meaningless jibes that served to wait it out until Ruth, who didn't know about Jared's problems with me, returned to her office and closed the door. As soon as she had done so, he turned and in a single movement tipped over the metal returns cart, spilling the recently received books all over the floor. He smiled at me and apologized. I did my best not to show any irritation or indeed any reaction at all as I slowly walked around and bent down to start collecting them. As I rose to my feet, I felt an impact on the back of my head and staggered. Behind me, Jared stood holding the book I had put aside, The Bone Turner's Tale, and had apparently picked it up to hit me with. But rather than offering me a fake apology or further violence, instead his eyes were locked on the book. We stood there in silence for a few seconds until he said something about needing something new to read, turned around and walked off. I was, I will admit, a bit unsettled. As far as I could recall, I had never seen Jared read, well, anything, really. The look in his eyes when he had left had something in it not entirely unlike fear. Still, it was a welcome relief to have him gone, and I quickly tidied up the rest of the books before Ruth noticed anything amiss. There was nothing else I recall that happened that day at the library, but on the way home afterwards I passed by Jared's house. I had moved back in with my parents while I got everything sorted out after university, and he had never moved out of his childhood home, so we still lived on the same street. It was late September at this point, so by the time I had walked back from the library it was
You
dark,
can't hold anymore.
and I noticed a small shape moving in the pool of orange light below the street lamp. As I got closer, I realized with a slight start that it was a rat, and not a dirty, wild rat, but a large, white one, quite well kept and clearly once a pet. But there was something very wrong with it. It was dragging itself slowly, pulling from the front legs, and I saw that the back half of it was flat, as though deflated somehow. I thought it must have been run over, but there was no blood or sign of crushing, nor did it seem to be in any actual pain. It just had a back half that flopped and twitched obscenely as it made its gradual way across the lighted pavement and out into the darkness. I just stood there and watched, transfixed by it, until it disappeared from view. Thinking about it now, I remember its head was turned at a strange angle, far further round than it should have been, although I might be getting confused. Many of these experiences run together when I look back on them. There was no light on in Jared's house, but I hurried home quickly after that. I didn't see Jared again for some time. At first I was just happy for the space, and as the days turned into weeks I started to feel something I wouldn't have expected to. Worry. If it hadn't been for the way he had left last time, it probably wouldn't have bothered me, but he had looked so strange. And even without him coming to the library, it was rare I would go a week without seeing him. By now it had been almost a month. Still, I resisted the urge to go to his house and check. If it turned out he was fine, then I'd be inviting a whole world of unpleasantness. And besides that, I reminded myself, he wasn't my problem anymore. It was late October when Jared's mother came in. It was near the end of the day, and outside was already dark. I was putting up a display about good Halloween reads before heading home, when I heard the door open. I turned around and there she was. It took me a few seconds to recognize her, if I'm honest. I hadn't seen much of her in the years since Jared and I had been close, and she had aged noticeably. Mrs. Hopworth wore a bulky overcoat, though it wasn't that cold yet, and her arm hung down in a sling. Something about the angle of the arm and how it hung there seemed faintly abnormal, and I wondered if she had broken it. When I asked Mrs. Hopworth if she was okay, she just stared at me, her eyes burning with hatred. With her good arm, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small black paperback. She threw it on the floor without saying a word and turned to leave. I couldn't help myself. I asked her if Jared was all right. She spun back and started to swear violently at me. Told me I had no business with her son and that I and my books were to stay away from him. As she spoke, I couldn't look away from her arm, and the odd ways it twisted as she gestured, how her fingers seemed to bend the wrong way. I was glad that Ruth had gone home early, as I didn't want her to witness the disturbing confrontation I had now apparently caused. When she had finished, Mrs. Hopworth spat towards me, though I noticed she was careful to avoid spitting at the book that now lay on the floor between us, and left. I put down the copy of Stephen King's Misery that I now realized I'd been clutching, and approached the discarded volume that lay on the carpet. The battered black cover seemed the same as when I had first seen it weeks ago, with that faded white title on the front. The Bone Turner's Tale. I reached down to pick it up, but before I did so, a thought flashed across my mind, a memory of the last time I had seen Jared, and I grabbed some tissues from the desk before using them to pick up the book. Even then I felt my skin crawl as I held it. I decided not to deal with it that night. I wasn't entirely sure that reading it in the daytime would be that much better, but the shadows cast from outside seemed to have gotten that much starker since the book had been brought back into my library, and it scared me. I placed it in the book returns cart and left, double-checking I had firmly locked the door behind me. It rained heavily that night. My room is in a converted attic, and when the weather is bad, it's as if I can hear every raindrop against the window that is just above my bed. It wasn't a storm. There wasn't the wind for it. It was just that heavy, pounding rain that drummed and beat on the glass above me. I couldn't sleep. There was a nagging apprehension in my mind, something that, after 3 hours lying in bed, had turned into almost a panic. How could I have just left the book? There was something wrong with it, that much was obvious. What if Ruth came in earlier than I did tomorrow and took it? What would happen to her? Should I have destroyed it? That last thought was quickly pushed away. I wasn't sure I had it in me to destroy a book, even one with such a strangeness to it. It surprised me just how easily I accepted that the Bone Turner's Tale had dark powers, but I suppose I've always felt that books have a sort of magic to them. So it was really just a confirmation of what I had suspected deep down for a long time. It was 2 in the morning when I decided that I couldn't just leave it there overnight. I got up, dressed, and quietly headed out into the rain towards the library, making sure to take my gloves. My coat was supposed to be water resistant, but still managed to soak in the 20 minutes it took me to walk there. I had the key from locking up that night and deactivated the alarm as I entered. It was almost pitch black inside, and part of me wanted to keep it that way, but I turned on as many of the lights as I could without it being immediately obvious outside the building. It wasn't many, and I still had to half feel my way through the foyer and into the library proper. As I approached the desk, the book returns cart where I had left the Bone Turner's Tale, I began to step less cautiously. It was darker in that corner of the library, and I put a hand out to steady myself against the handle of the small metal cart. I'd taken my gloves off at that point, and my hand came away wet. I quickly fumbled for the torch I had snatched before heading out and turned it on. Red dripped and pulsed from the cart, soaking the pages and forming a small pool around it. The books were bleeding. I laughed at that. It seemed so appropriate somehow, so utterly correct that those neighboring books should suffer, should be contaminated by it. Just as it seemed right and proper that when my torch found the Bone Turner's Tale, it was dry, unmarked by the gory scene around it. I put my gloves back on and carefully took out that sinister volume and placed it on the desk. Perhaps I should have fought harder against the temptation to look inside, but my curiosity was too strong. The thick gloves made turning individual pages almost impossible, and I still had enough good sense to keep them on. So I just opened it on a few random pages and started reading. Perhaps I was being paranoid. After all, I touched the book with my bare hands when it was first given into the library, and had no problems. but the image of Jared's mother wouldn't leave my head. How her arm had twisted when it moved. I decided to keep the gloves on. It was written in prose, and certainly seemed to be a story of some kind. The part I read dealt with an unnamed man, at various points referred to as the Bone Turner, the Bonesmith, or just the Turner, watching an assembled group of people as they made their way into a small village. It's unclear from what I read whether he is traveling with them or simply following them, but I remember being unsettled by the details he observed in them. The way the parson would move his hand over his mouth whenever he stared too long at the nuns, or how the cook looked at the meat he prepared with the same eyes that looked at the pardoner. It was only at that point that I realized the book was describing the pilgrims from the Canterbury Tales. Now, this certainly wasn't some lost section of a Chaucer classic. It was written in modern English, with none of the archaic spelling or pronunciation of the original. Besides that, the writing itself was of questionable quality. There was something compelling about it, though. The debate about how finished the Canterbury Tales were, well, it's a very real debate. In the prologue, over 100 tales are promised, but the most complete surviving version doesn't even reach 24. The book just sort of ends, with Chaucer adding a short epilogue imploring God for forgiveness, a plea that is generally read as sarcastic or rhetorical. I flicked ahead a few pages and found the bonesmith had apparently crept up to the miller while he slept. He described him silently reaching inside him, and it's a bit hazy. All I remember clearly is the line, "And from his rib a flute to play that merry tune of Marrow took." And as for the rest, I don't recall in detail. But I know that I almost threw up, and that the miller did not survive. This was on page 16, and it was a thick book. I turned to the frontispiece, desperately curious as to how this book had ended up in our library. In the harsh light of the torch, I could see the creases and peeling edges of the Chiswick Library label, which usually meant it had been removed and restuck, or taken from another book entirely. I could even see the edges of another label underneath. Using a pair of scissors, I carefully peeled off the top one, but was disappointed. It was the label for another library, probably the last place it had been left, although I think it must have been in Scandinavia, because it was something like the Library of Jürgensburg, or Jürgenlight, or Jürgenlicht, or something like that. It didn't help me.
That is, Mike, to reach
I was all set to return to reading the thing when I heard the sound of breaking glass behind me. I turned around to see Jared Hopworth standing in front of the shattered window. Or at least, I assume it was Jared, as it demanded the book from me in Jared's voice, but wore loose-fitting trousers and a thick coat with a hood that almost completely covered his face. Or its face. He was longer than Jared had been, and stood at a strange angle as though his legs were too stiff to use. When he gestured for the book, I saw that his fingers looked sharp, as though the skin at the ends were being pushed into a tight point by something inside. I told him that the library was closed, because at that moment I could think of nothing else to say. He ignored me and demanded again that I give him the book. That was when I did something a little rash, which is to say I punched him. I had never really thrown a punch in anger before, or even desperation, so it came as quite a shock to me when I managed to drive a single solid fist into his solar plexus. But as I did this is the part that still gives me nightmares, I felt his flesh give way and almost retract, drawing me in close. And then I felt his ribs shift, shut tight around my hand as though his rib cage were trying to bite me. They were sharper than I would have thought possible, and at last, this was what actually started me screaming. Never before or since have I ever screamed like that, and I'm still a bit surprised I'm capable of making such a noise, but there you have it. In my panic, I dropped the copy of The Bone Turner's Tale, and in less than a second, Jared was on it. He released my hand and grabbed it with a frantic desperation before he turned to run back out the way he came in. I started to chase after him until I saw how he was moving, how many limbs he had. He had added some extras. That was the moment it finally all got too much for me, and I stopped running. It wasn't my book. It wasn't my responsibility. And I had no idea what I was dealing with. So I didn't. I just stood there in a daze and watched the thing that was once Jared disappear out into the rain. I never saw him again. The police turned up soon after. Someone had apparently heard my screams and called in a report. I spun some tale about falling asleep at my desk and being woken up by an attempted robbery. God knows how I explained the bloody books, because it wasn't some disappearing phantom. It took weeks to get out. Everyone seemed to believe me, though, and miraculously I kept my job. I haven't seen Jared in the years since, and I haven't done any further research on the book. The best scenario I can possibly imagine is that this statement is the last I ever need to hear or speak about Jared Hopworth or the Bone Turner's Tale. Statement ends. Well, this makes me deeply unhappy. I've barely scratched the surface of the archives, and I've already uncovered evidence of 2 separate surviving books from Jürgen Leitner's library. Until he mentioned that, I was tempted to dismiss much of it out of hand, but as it stands now, I believe every word. I've seen what Leitner's work can do, and this news, even 17 years out of date, is still very concerning to me. I'm going to have a discussion with Elias as to what we can do to address the issue. I know he'll just give me the old record and study, not interfere or contain speech again, but I at least need to make him aware of it. Tim and Sasha have cross-referenced the events here with police reports, and sure enough, there was a warrant issued for the arrest of Jared Hopworth for breaking and entering, as well as assault. He was never found, though, and the crimes weren't serious enough to keep the case active for very long. I've been doing as much research myself as possible, but the book seems to have vanished along with him. I asked Martin to try and hunt down Mr. Adekoya himself for a follow-up, but have been informed that he passed away in 2006. He was found lying dead in the middle of the road on the night of April 17th. Despite the fact that there was no crushing or trauma marks on the body, the inquest ruled it a hit-and-run car accident due to the mangled position in which he was found. It was a closed casket funeral. Recording ends. Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 18, The Man Upstairs. Statement of Christoph Rudenko regarding his interactions with a first-floor resident of Welbeck House, Wandsworth. Original statement given December 12th, 2008. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. Never buy a ground floor flat. It may seem like a good idea, especially if, like me, you just spent a decade dragging shopping up 3 flights of stairs every week, but it's noisier, always has a worse view, and is far more prone to break-ins and other problems. And then there is the matter of upstairs neighbors. I know that higher floors will more often than not also have people living above you, and moving from living in a top floor flat to the ground floor like I did is not a common thing, but it's still true. I never had any real concerns about it until I moved to the ground floor of Welbeck House. These days I keep a much closer eye on those I live near. Welbeck House is a 5-story block of flats in Wandsworth town centre. A great area to live, actually. It's close enough to London proper that you can commute in easily, and enough amenities that you don't often need to, especially if, like me, you're self-employed. It wasn't cheap, but I've always been good with money, so when I decided to try and actually buy a place at age 34, I was able to afford a nice flat. After almost a year of searching, I settled on the ground floor at Welbeck. At the time, I hadn't really given much thought to my neighbours. Those I had encountered in the course of buying the place had seemed nice enough, and the previous owners of my flat hadn't mentioned anything. On the day I moved in, this would have been late 2002, I saw a man smoking, leaning out of the window just above my own. It was a grey, overcast day, and the forecast had said there would be rain later, so I was keen to move the last of my boxes inside and start unpacking, and I didn't really pay him much attention. I remember that he was wearing a hooded jacket, though, pulled up tight and obscuring most of his face. We locked eyes briefly. At least, I assume we did. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt him looking at me. I could swear I smelled the weirdest odour. It's hard to describe, halfway between the smell of a pavement after rain on a hot day and chicken that's starting to turn. It was unpleasant, to say the least, but the wind changed and it was gone as quickly as it came. The man in the upstairs window kept watching as I took my boxes inside, just continuing to smoke in silence, till at one point I came outside to get the last bits and noticed he was gone. I was slightly spooked by the encounter. It's hard to say exactly why, as aside from the smell, which could have come from anywhere, there was nothing outwardly upsetting about it. Yet something in the man's manner had shaken me. I didn't even know at the time whether it was a man. That was just an assumption I made, but I certainly had no plans to check. I'm quite a private person, so the idea of going round and trying to meet my neighbours at all was not one that I gave a lot of consideration, let alone this one who had spent the better part of half an hour staring at me. I decided to ignore the whole thing and get on with the process of moving in. I was very successful at ignoring the man upstairs, at least at first. It wasn't difficult, as he was usually quiet and rarely came out of his flat as far as I could tell. In fact, as the time in my new home wore on, I started to recognise the other residents of Welbeck House. The white family that lived across the hall with their little girl. I sometimes heard her in the evening, loudly protesting her bedtime. The old spinster next door, Diane, I think her name was, or Diana, the Asian guy on the first floor that worked nights and slammed the doors too much. I doubt I ever exchanged more than a dozen words with any of them, but I began to know their sounds and their habits. In all that time, though, I'm not sure I ever saw the man who lived above me. Not in the hallway, not out the window. It was like he didn't exist, which was fine by me, except that I would still very occasionally catch a whiff of that smell, rotten and earthy. It would catch me by surprise, and I'd usually spend a minute trying to track it down before it vanished. Once, I swear that as I stopped to look around, I heard the door upstairs close quietly. It seemed to me pretty obvious it was him. It wasn't ideal, but his hygiene problem was nobody's business but his own, and having figured out the source of the smell, it stopped bothering me quite so much on those rare moments that I caught it in the air currents of our building. It didn't enter my home, although I did take to lighting scented candles just in case, a habit I still keep up today. I decided all that was important to me was that he was quiet, which he was, at least for the first couple of years. The banging started on 5th July 2004. I know because it was the day before my 37th birthday, and I was unpacking a crate of beer for the friends I had invited over. At first I assumed the man upstairs was just nailing something into the wall, but after 10 minutes it still hadn't stopped. Instead it just seemed to move. While at first it had sounded like something being nailed into his wall, the banging started to move downwards, until it seemed he was knocking things right into the floor. At one point he was hammering directly over the light, causing it to sway slightly with each blow. This went on for almost an hour, and all I could do was try to ignore it, as there was nothing I wanted to do less than climb those stairs and knock on his door. Even so, by the time it finally finished, I was on the verge of doing exactly that. It did stop, though, and after it became clear it wasn't coming back anytime soon, I tried to put it out of my mind and get back to my preparations. Thankfully, there was no disturbance from upstairs during my small party the following night, just the family from across the hall at one point asking for the music to be turned down. In fact, I didn't hear anything from him for another 2 weeks, when the banging started again. Again, it was almost an hour of hammering first into the walls, then moving down onto the floor, before stopping altogether. I was not happy about this, as I'm sure you can imagine, but I was still reluctant to confront this nameless person who lived over me, so I let it slide. From that point on, every 2 weeks it came, the hammering for an hour or thereabouts. I tried to find someone to complain to, but it seemed like whoever lived there owned the flat outright, so there was no landlord or housing association that I could report him to. The final straw came about 6 months later. It was actually a very simple thing. I got a package delivered incorrectly to my flat. It was addressed to Mr. Toby Carlyle, and the flat number on it was not mine, but that of my upstairs neighbour. The envelope was thick and soft. It must have been mainly full of bubble wrap or other packing material. It wasn't much, but it gave me another reason to go upstairs, and while delivering it, I could politely request that he stop his fortnightly hammering. It was harder than I thought to walk up those stairs, and I was surprised to find that my legs were shaking slightly as I reached the top. I got another whiff of that dank, rotten smell as I approached. The carpet immediately in front of the door was stained, ever so slightly, a darker colour than it should have been, as though something had leaked out from underneath it. The wood was old and worn compared to the others in the building, which looked to have been replaced relatively recently. There was no number on it, or any indication that it was, in fact, Toby Carlyle who lived there. I knocked, trying to give the action a confidence that I frankly did not feel. There was no answer, so I knocked again, louder this time, and I heard some movement from inside, gradually heading towards the door. The steps were muffled, like he was walking over thick carpet, until they stopped on the other side. There was no sound at all. I waited for a minute and was just about to knock again when the door opened, just a crack. There didn't seem to be any lights on inside. It wasn't open wide enough for me to get a good look, or even see the man himself, but it was enough that I heard when a cracked, ragged voice spoke. It said, "What do you want?" Through the crack I was hit by a sudden wave of that rancid air and reeled backwards, fighting back the urge to vomit. Through it I just about managed to stammer out the question as to whether he was Toby Carlyle, that I'd had a delivery for him. There was silence for a second. Then a hand shot out and grabbed the package I held, pulling it out of my grasp before I had a chance to fully realize what was happening. The hand was thin and pale, with long, filthy yellow fingernails. On the back, I saw a single dark red mark that might have been a cut or a lesion, but it was gone before I had a chance to see it in more detail. The door slammed in my face, and I was left standing in the hall, nauseous and confused. As I turned to go, I noticed that there was a spot of viscous liquid on my jacket sleeve, where the hand had brushed me, thick and off-white. I had to throw the jacket out in the end. I couldn't get rid of the smell. And so that was it for a long time. The man upstairs was named Toby, and he was a disgusting shut-in who smelled rancid and occasionally made hammering noises. It was a long way from ideal, but it was something I could understand and live with. 2 years passed like this, and I had almost forgotten about him, to be honest. He had become just another part of my life and could be lived around. It wasn't until late 2007 I had cause to really think about him again. My mother's health had taken a turn for the worst over the previous few months, and I had made the decision to move back up to Sheffield to be nearer to her. As I mentioned, I'm self-employed, so the move wasn't as much of a difficulty as it might have been, but it did leave me with the need to sell my flat. I don't want to get bogged down with the details of my mother's ailments. In the end, she actually passed away a few months later from complications following an operation. I still ended up moving, though for a very different reason. It was difficult to sell the place. Every time someone came round for a viewing, it ended the same way, and I started to dread when the inevitable question would come, "What's that smell?" It was the third time that the potential buyers, a nice professional couple who worked in the city, pointed out the stain on the living room ceiling. It was subtle at first, a slight discoloration that I had managed to overlook. They assumed it was a leak, and I did too, promising to have a plumber come over and check it out, though I didn't hear back from them anyway. I did call for a plumber, but for whatever reason was told that it would be another week before they could see me. I tried to have a couple more viewings in that time, but the stain on the ceiling was becoming more obvious, and the smell had begun to pervade my whole flat, to the point where I was thinking about staying in a hotel until the plumber arrived. I was starting to doubt it was a leaking water pipe. As it grew, it started to turn a dark yellow in colour, and glistened ever so slightly when the light hit it. I knew it was something to do with the flat upstairs, though when I went up to ask this time, my knocking went unanswered. Finally, the plumber arrived. He wrinkled his nose when he entered, though didn't make any comment about it. I assume unpleasant smells are just part of his job. I pointed him towards the stain on the ceiling, and he looked momentarily confused, before telling me what I already knew, that this didn't look like a problem with the pipes. Still, he said he'd need to knock through the ceiling to have a look, and I'd need a contractor to come and redo that bit of ceiling anyway. I stood back when he put up his stepladder and climbed up to have a look at it. He put on a pair of rubber gloves and gingerly touched the spot, testing it with his fingers. It collapsed almost immediately, buckling and tearing like wet cardboard, and the fluid that oozed out of it was a sickly yellow in colour, with viscous white lumps glistening in it. The plumber looked like he was going to throw up. I did throw up. He made his apologies and said he'd have to call someone. I didn't try to stop him leaving. I was furious, and the anger that surged through me overcame any apprehension I might have felt from approaching the flat upstairs. I stormed up and began to hammer on the door, shouting and threatening that I'd call the police if he didn't answer. On my third knock, the door swung inwards ever so slightly, and I realized it was not locked. There is little in my life that I regret quite as much as going inside. I pushed the door open as much as I could, but it didn't open very wide, as there seemed to be some sort of resistance behind it. The smell would have been overpowering, but by this point I was almost used to it and fought down the nausea. There was no light coming from inside, and I fumbled on the wall for a switch. I found it, and the instant before I flicked it on, I realized I felt something soft and wet on the wall next to it. Unfortunately, before I had a chance to fully comprehend what I was feeling, I had turned on the light and saw Toby Carlyle's flat in its entirety. The light that came on was weak and tinged with red, but it was enough to see by. I looked around and saw that every surface, the walls, the floor, the tables, everything except the curtained windows, was covered in meat. Steaks, chunks of chicken, even a whole leg of what I assume was once lamb, had been nailed everywhere. There were layers of it, the newest additions simply stuck on top of the old, and a putrid yellow-white rot could be seen where the oldest pieces had long since turned to liquid. Flies buzzed thick in the air, and maggots carpeted the place. Looking up, I saw the light, too, had been smeared with meat, causing the place to be bathed in that dull red light. Lying there, in the center of the hallway, was the body of Toby Carlyle. His hood was pulled back, and I saw his face was covered in puckered septic lesions and holes. I couldn't tell which of them had once housed his eyes. I was frozen in place by the raw horror of what I was seeing, and almost automatically my hand found its way to my phone and I dialed the police. It was only then that my eyes drifted numbly towards the kitchen. There, in the center of the floor, was a pile of discarded meat and bone, stacked almost as high as a person. It seemed less decayed than the rest of it, though that foul yellow fluid oozed from it, and this is the reason I'm talking to your institute, you see. Everything else could be put down to the problems of a very, very sick man. Nothing supernatural about it, but when I looked at that heaped pile of meat, it moved. I don't know quite how to explain it, other than to tell you that it opened its eyes. It opened all its eyes. The next thing I remember is the police's arrival and a lot of questions from officers trying to hide the fact that they had just finished vomiting. The pile of meat was gone, though the bits that had been nailed to the walls and floors remained. I told the police everything that I just told you, although they dismissed the last bit out of hand. I believe they had to call in a hazmat team in the end. There's not much more to it, really. The rest of the story is largely arguing with insurance companies and counting how many showers it took before I felt clean again. I did move out in the end, and now live in a house in Clapham with some friends, people who are very clean and don't mind the fact that I've recently become a vegetarian. Statement ends. Well, I'm certainly glad I had my lunch before recording this statement. Looking into this one has proven a bit tricky, as police, hospital, and even fire department records give wildly conflicting reports. What we can be sure of is that on the evening of October the 22nd, 2007, there was an incident at a first-floor flat in Welbeck House that involved hazardous biological material and led to the recovery of the body of one Toby Carlyle, the legal owner of the property. The cause of death was listed as gangrene. We contacted Mr. Rudenko, who confirmed that since moving he had had no further experiences he believed to be linked to these events and, after an extensive course of counseling, was attempting to move past them. He did corroborate the existing statement, though, saying he still believed it to be a true account of what happened to him. I'm not entirely sure I agree, although obviously there's little in the way of evidence to the contrary. One thing puzzles me, however. Sasha managed to get access to some of Toby Carlyle's old financial records, and it didn't appear like he had any real money coming in. And what he did have was largely going to pay council tax on the property. There are no records of transactions at any supermarkets or online delivery firms, and Tim even asked around some of the local butchers, as Martin is still off sick. At the end of all this, we've still been unable to answer one question. Where was he getting the meat? I don't know why, but it bothers me. End recording.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike International license. Today's episode was written and performed by Jonathan Sims.